Hello, everyone. It's Michael Jaco with Unleashing Intuition Secrets. I have Ian Trotter with us today. He's high stakes treason, how John Brennan compromised American security for millions of dollars. I've been listening to this. I have it on the audio format, Ian, and it is rock solid. You are just crushing it. The information, like I told you before, a lot of us do NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and we can't really go into a lot of detail about some of the stuff that we've seen and we know about. But you are bringing it out, so I'm very happy about that because it's basically going to bring down this illegal, crazy system. So thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks. It's a pleasure, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, very very
Yeah,
good, very good. Roger
high
Stone, you want
stakes.
me to read a little bit of what Roger Stone said?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Let's do it.
let me because it's revelatory. Who is John Brennan? This is a four by Roger Stone. Who is John Brennan, and how did an admitted communist become the head of the Central Intelligence Agency? Many of us had that because I was there when John Brennan was there. It was like we knew that he was a former communist, or former, or still is, I think. Former CIA Director John Brennan is more culpable than perhaps anyone in the genesis of Russiagate. Even though he was fired immediately by President Trump upon his initial arrival in the White House, Brennan sowed the seeds for Trump's destruction behind the scenes throughout his campaign and during the presidential transition. Brennan's subversive stain permeated through Trump's 4 year term and caused immeasurable damage. So it goes on, a few more paragraphs after that. But, Roger Stone, suffered under the hands of the next administration. So amazing that he's coming out and saying that this is one of the most monumental books that's out there right now. So that's high praise, and I agree.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. I initially, Michael, I had approached General Flynn about providing a forward to this information. I sent it over to him. He was going to write the forward. He got busy, and then I started dialoguing with his scheduler. Just couldn't fit in time for him to concentrate on forward to this. But and of course, you're talking about NDAs, right? And so he's got to be. I'm sure he's got to be very delicate in how he maneuvers this world
Sure.
that he was thrown into, right? Because he's in many ways he's right in the center of the Russian collusion, and so it was actually at an event at Mar-a-Lago, and Roger Stone was there. James O'Keefe, and I approached both of them about the material. As soon as I approached Roger about the material, he said, send it right over. Within 24, 48 hours, he shot me a text back and he says, you want me to write the forward to this? Now, I hadn't had a conversation in regards to Flynn and some of the other folks, and John Kiriakou is another guy that's written a nice forward to this, and Brooks Agnew is a former speechwriter for Alan Keyes. People that I've relationships I've created with guys over the years of doing my own work, right?
Hmm.
And so Kiriakou is a whole other story. But Roger says, no, you want me to write the forward to this? I says, hold on, Roger. I said, I got General Flynn that's trying to make time in his schedule to write this. He says, no. You want me to write the forward? So he like literally he says, Ian, he says, no, this guy needs to be tried for treason. I want him. Constitutionally, if you've committed treason on the United States, you're subject to the death penalty, and that's exactly where Stone's footing is. That's what he wants.
Yeah, definitely.
Um,
Definitely. And you make reference to some figures in the past. During George Washington's time, we had some treasonous people back during that time frame, and he almost got killed by you know some people that were basically disclosing, just like John Brennan did.
yeah, that's exactly right. So in a nutshell, and let me get a little bit of background for listeners and viewers to understand what came about for me to get involved in this. And it's not like I ever had a target on John Brennan. He wasn't in my crosshairs, if you will. It wasn't somebody I was looking into. It was out of 2024. Now 9/11 is something I've always been skeptical of. All right, and we trace he was a chief of staff for George Tenet under 9/11. That's a whole other area. I don't really talk about it too much. A little bit in this book, but I mention it basically. But at 2024 CPAC, I was approached I was running a podcast, and this well-dressed man, very mild-mannered, came up to me and says, "Hey, will you do a podcast with me?" He presents a binder to me in front of me, and Bannon War Room's down the hall, huge stage. Newsmax is down the hall the other way, huge stage. And even the small independent guys like myself, nobody's paying any credence to this guy. Nobody's listening to him. He says, "I've been working on this for years, and it's critical national intelligence. Nothing classified." And it was one of my first questions to him, Michael. I said, "Is there anything in here that's classified?" He says, "No, but the problem is people don't listen to me because I'm a former FBI agent, and the FBI prohibits me. He says they would prohibit me from publishing this information. And first off, they'd have to give me the okay, and there's no way they'd give me the okay. And as an example, he says I gave a tip to the FBI about this information way back in 2011, and they did nothing about it. And matter of fact, he was working for a private contractor because they left the CIA in 2000, and he shows up to work at Cy Valence is the name of the company, and they says, "Pack your bag." They says, "Were you talking to the FBI yesterday and submitting a tip about criminality?" He says, "Yeah, I found criminality from John Brennan and the Obama administration." And he says, "Well, pack your bags, you're fired." So not only does he get fired trying to get his former employer, the FBI, involved in investigating this, but his whole family just ostracizes him. He gets a death threat, and he just gets hammered. But as a true warrior, this guy is, he keeps studying this, keeps researching. And in 2021, as a matter of fact, he submits a 25-page letter, a synopsis on the material, the binder that he presents to me, and he gets nobody interested. So I says, "Wait a second, you're a follow the money guy." And he says, "Yeah, that's what this is all about." So this guy cashed in, murdering Americans, maiming Americans, and he cashed in on it when he could have prevented it. And I says, "Okay, that's where." And we mentioned a couple days ago, you and I had some dialogue, and that's where a trigger just switched to me. And I says, "Look," and I'm a guy that never served in the military. I actually don't even have a journalistic background at all. It's just I see some of these major flaws in the system, and the only way I believe that we can correct this is if the average guy like myself, and like yourself, and you're not that you're average because you're not, you're not an average guy, but we're average people more or less, right? I mean,
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
it's up to us. It's up to us to hold these people accountable. So that's what people are getting. And the point of what I'm saying is that, and I make it very clear in the introduction, that the crux of the information, crux of the research on the former head of the CIA, and as you mentioned, and as Roger mentions in his forward, this is a guy that voted in 1976 for Gus Hall because he was so sick of the system. This is back in the mid 70s, and he votes for the communist CPUSA, the communist candidate for president. I mean, dude, you might be sick of the system, but communism in the United States and a constitutional republic do not mix, will never mix, and aren't ever going to mix. And so this is the guy. This is who we know, who Obama appointed to be his director of the CIA in 2013. But the point of this is that as people go through the pages of High Stakes Treason, yes, it's my work. Yes, I'm the author of it. I've copywritten it. Post Hill Press has published it. But all this information that you're getting, the majority of it, the credit goes to this former FBI guy because he brought it to me, and I'm simply amplifying it. I'm putting it in my own words. But this is years of research from John, and that's his name. I disclosed his name in the introduction. And this is a guy that served over 10 years in the FBI in the DC field office, and I put in an award that he received. The FBI thought really highly of this guy, but the problem, he was probably pushing the wrong buttons, and they got rid of him. But I'm gonna we're carrying his voice forward. So in a nutshell, and I'll keep continuing here. In a nutshell, what people are going to find in the pages of High Stakes Treason is basically what I'm calling the axis of communism. Bush referred to it as axis of evil, and he had these different smoke screens as to why to go in Iraq and why to go in Afghanistan and take out Saddam Hussein. And I'm calling those smoke screens. What it looks like is this Al Qaeda, which was a database, the Mujahideen, when the Soviets were fighting Afghanistan, it looks like the CIA created ISIS. And then of course the American troops go in Afghanistan after that. But this database of terror activity is in 1990 is what the Analysis Corporation creates. And Brennan being the head of counterterrorism in the CIA, and then working up. As a matter of fact, before he gets into the Obama administration, he's the president of the Analysis Corporation. TAC is the acronym that is used frequently in the book. Now, this database is critical because after 9/11, the NCTC is created. The Terrorist Threat Interrogation Center is created, and then out of that, and it's Executive Order 13354, Bush, the NCTC eventually has created that. Well, that's John Brennan's baby. That's his creation, and so all of the proteges, all of his people get funneled in to the NCTC. And I'll read a quote which is astonishing. I don't know if you've gotten to it yet or not, and I appreciate you going through it, but in Brennan's own words, this is the power that he was able to create at the NCTC. And keep in mind, formerly it was the TTIC. So the idea, he says, behind the TTIC was that we needed to have some place in the government where all counterterrorism information would reside. The good news, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing here, the good news and the bad news is that the TTIC, then became known as the NCTC, and it still exists, had more access to more information than anywhere in the government, which means he's able to create what are called code word compartments. And that's not new technology. It's been around since the 70s. But he's funneling all this information regarding terror activity. He's monitoring Anwar al-Awlaki. He's monitoring the Zarniya brothers, and he's compartmentalizing all that information. And only someone with a need to know, which would be the person that creates it, would have access to it, which means FBI, CIA, NSA, they're not getting that information. Yep. So he's able to sequester and identify his various terror tracking, the terror threats, and he's able to channel that right into a code word compartment. This is the allegation. This is how we show that he was able to hold on to stocks, right? Because he's the president of the Analysis Corporation. Then he was running the NCTC. Then he's part of the Obama administration, senior advisor on Homeland Security. He's able to hold on to these stocks. And that's a direct conflict of interest. And this is the whole premise of the book, is that he's given an ethics waiver to go investigate the Norway bombing, Anders Breivik, and that's what tips off this former FBI agent. And part of this, what's called a ethics waiver, right? Ethically, he shouldn't be holding on to stocks of a indispensable government contractor, which is feeding him the information to know where terrorists are, what they're doing, who's buying bombs, who's using credit cards, their own credit cards, that sort of thing. He's able to get all that information. He's supposed to relinquish those stocks, and even on this is public, right? And so even on a financial disclosure form, and he's holding on, but he changes the names. There's a woman named Rachel Molinaro, and at the bottom of this disclosure, she's noting that he would be basically liquidating those stocks from a 401k into an IRA. He never did that. We show the SEC documentation. He never did that. He held on to those stocks illegally because he knew Congress would fund the war on terror, right? Which just ended under Biden, but it lapsed about 20 years or so. Congress would fund the war on terror because, well, a terrorist threat. The average American's going crazy. Yeah, we need to defend ourselves. Well, what Brennan's doing is as that Congress funds the war on terror, that stock value increases. And in 2009, the $50,000 valuation of the stock turns into 3 years later, turns into just shy of $5 million. $4.85 million is what we.
Yeah, he was also, like you describe in a book, he was almost going to be a billionaire. And the SEC was like, no, you can't, multiply it by that many times. But you also made a very, very good point that when the Soviet Union collapsed, they needed something else to keep themselves alive and keep the funding coming. So they created this terrorist network, pretty much.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, there's also some interesting overlapping that I've gotten into recently in regards to what Mike Benz has been talking about, former State Department employee. Now, Mike Benz has looked at a guy, I mentioned him in the book. His name is Michael Springham. He's a former State Department Springman. He's a former State Department employee serving in Jeddah. Now, what he was told to do is basically, and this is what he was talking about back in 2003. He was talking about giving visas to terrorists. And he would be approached and he would just say, give this guy a visa. He would say, wait, why am I giving this guy a visa? Don't ask, just do it. And he goes into the Jeddah consulate and he says, 80, 90%, I can't remember what he says, 89% of these people are CIA. I'm one of 3 employees of the State Department. What's the CIA doing controlling all of this? Well, this is the manipulation. It's called a CT intel monopoly is what we use that Brennan seemingly is creating. And that's why before we started this discussion, I started talking about George Tenet and what he may have known in 9/11. What were they doing to allow these terror activities to develop and go off when they could have been preventing it? But the point with Mike Benz is that he's drawing in Ryan Ruth. Now this is the guy now we know. We know that Trump has been a target of the deep state ever since he declared his candidacy. Even before even when he was starting to look at possibility of running for president, Clinton and that regime were just after that guy from day one. Well, he's an enemy of the deep state because he's showing he knows some of this apparatus they've been able to create over the decades and manipulate intelligence. This is my view, and manipulate intelligence at the cost of American lives. Now, Ryan Ruth, interestingly enough, it seems like he's a contractor for the CIA. He's recruiting Afghani and Iranian soldiers to fight in Ukraine. This is the guy that tried to assassinate the president. And what he's doing is the same thing. He's doing the same thing that Springman is doing in Jeddah, only he's doing it for Ukraine, whereas he's asking for passports to give these terrorists visas. It's the same overlapping. So the question becomes now, and this is from Mike Benz, and I support this. The question is, did John Brennan order Ryan Ruth to take out Donald Trump? Okay, now why would it be John Brennan? Well, because now I spent a week and a half in D.C., Michael. I spent a week and a half in D.C. I walked the halls of the Senate. I walked the halls of the House. I lined up a few meetings. I passed out 100 copies of this book. And people are saying, well, okay, so, follow the money. This is insider trading. It's happening all the time. It doesn't make it right, but it's happening all the time. So there's got to be a clincher here, right? So why is it that John Brennan is spearheading this movement to target Donald Trump? Why would it be that possibly he could have directed this guy Ryan Ruth to take out Trump? Well, because he knows that he's hiding this massive profitability, and that would have just been in one company he probably owned, and that was the Analysis Corporation. This is massive. This is massive treason if proven in the court of law, which I believe it should be, and it could be, and it will be. That's my belief. We'll see. The guy's 70. This is proven in court of law. This is aiding and abetting an enemy during the time of war, which is the war on terror. That is the definition of treason. This guy's committed treason. He's allowed Americans to die, and this would be the Boston Marathon bombing. He's allowed Americans to die. He's even allowed a NATO ally, right? He's even allowed a NATO ally to be damaged. Anders Breivik, I think he killed 76 people. What we know is that through XQ score and the whistleblowing of Edward Snowden, we know that John Brennan could have directly stopped that event from happening, and he didn't stop it because we allege that he knew that stock value was going to increase, and he had a complete manipulation on terror activity globally.
Yeah, and even back before 9/11, the CIA stopped sharing information that they were getting on terrorist communications leading up to 9/11 that could have stopped it. So there again, we have all this culpable stuff that's going on in the CIA for causing these terrorist operations. Very, very similar to during John F. Kennedy's time frame, where they wanted to do like terrorists from Cuba were going to get planes and crash them into buildings in New York, and so they just dusted that off and used that again. But this time they got away with it, and they did it for real.
Yeah, Operation Northwoods. Now let me dig a little bit deeper here for your viewers. There's a woman, and she's critical right now in exposing basically the smear that went on between her and General Flynn. Now Cambridge University, if folks are listening to what Patrick Byrne has been saying, now Patrick Byrne was co-founder of Overstock, former CEO of Overstock, great guy. And he's very liberal. His policies are liberal, but he says, "Wait a second. There's election rigging going on. There's election fraud. I'm going to stand up for that." So that's in a nutshell who Patrick Byrne is. Now, outside of that, interesting enough, is that back in 2006, Michael, Patrick Byrne was recruited into the CIA by a guy named David S. Cohen. Now, David S. Cohen was head of OFAC, that's Foreign Acquisitions. When the Analysis Corporation went public, they had their IPO, they did some name changes, became Sotera Defense Solutions. It gets sold to a UK financial investment firm called Ares Management. They're based in Hong Kong. That's CCP controlled. Interestingly enough, there's some overlapping here. But John Brennan, the guy that brings Patrick Byrne in the CIA in 2006, well, he's the guy at OFAC that would have approved that sale to Ares Management, and he just so happens to become the number two for John Brennan when Brennan becomes the director of the CIA. So this all kind of leads up to the Russian collusion hoax, right? Which is now kind of unraveling. John Brennan is subpoenaed right now in the South Florida district at Fort Pierce, and I think it's Judge Cannon that's running that. The critical attorney behind that is Jason Quinones. Now, helping Jason Quinones is a guy named Mike Davis. And Mike Davis runs Article 3 Project out of D.C., and I've communicated with him a little bit. I'm trying to get this information to him because if Brennan gets back into a testifying situation in a courtroom or in Congress, he should be answering questions in regards to the material in this book. But David S. Cohen, of course, is critical in exposing that. Now, there's a Cambridge, and I mentioned Svetlana Lakova. There's a Cambridge angle to this, and I'm speaking about Cambridge University. It looks like this guy named Stephen Halper, Halper. Stephen Halper ran the connection between Cambridge and D.C. And what was going on is he's a former FBI and CIA asset. Stephen Halper is the guy that creates or spearheads the creation of the Steele dossier with Christopher Steele. And of course, that is showing that supposedly, which it didn't happen, that Trump and the Russians colluded against the 2016 election to keep Clinton out of office, right?
Right.
Well, it's all baloney. It's all hogwash. Svetlana Lakova is told, and they take they try to smear General Flynn out of this, and saying that they had inappropriate relations, that sort of thing. That was smoke and mirrors. It wasn't true. It wasn't correct. Let me bring it up and dig a little bit deeper for folks to get into this right now. So as of yesterday, there's a guy out of D.C. that says he's very close to a man named Mark Judge. Now, Mark Judge released, and I'll send this to you, Michael. He just released an article on Real Politics, exposing some of these financial connections to this election rigging. And in 2020, that was a flat-out stolen election. We know this. In Belgrade, there was a data center that John Brennan created with the Huawei company. That's Huawei. He created this data center with Huawei. That data center manipulated Dominion servers, which directly affected election results in 2020. So that's also critical to understand because it threads in John Brennan. And now we've got Maduro in Brooklyn, and one of his major generals is over in Rikers. We've got two heads of that Smartmatic system that was created in Venezuela. That it was a system that was used to manipulate those 2020 elections. We've got those guys in U.S. custody. That is very, very important. Digging a little bit deeper, as I said, and I want to bring back Cambridge. What we saw are Facebook ads running with something called Cambridge Analytica. Now, if we go to the University of Washington, Michael, there's something called the Center for Informed Public, and that's part of something called the EIP, the Election Integrity Project. It looks like it's that facility in Washington that was the spearhead that worked with Dominion not only to rig the election, but also to create something out of Germany. and that's called the Hamilton 68 dashboard. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Okay, so the Hamilton 68 dashboard is something out of a Soros-funded program called the Marshall Plan. And the Hamilton 68 dashboard is basically creating these Russian bots, which are going in and tainting and swaying American average, public usership. But all they are spies. That's it's I'm just listening to this. This is kind of like breaking for me, Michael. So I'm still trying to kind of grab my brain cells around this.
Right.
But ultimately, the tracks are leading back to NATO. Right now, remember what we say in high stakes treason, and you can get it right now as you've done. I appreciate it. You can get an audio form and just listen to it. If you want a signed copy, I can give you a signed copy, or you can order it on Amazon. But NATO is who John Brennan sequestered, hid that intelligence regarding what Anders Breivik was doing. And by the way, Anders Breivik, the guy that carried out that massacre, he's using his, and this is why I mentioned, he's using his own credit card to buy these products, which he used as explosive devices. So he left a massive manifesto and paper trail that we're showing through the programs called PRISM and X-Keyscore, through Edward Snowden at the NSA. We know allegedly that Brennan had control over this intel, this information, and he purposely hid it so that the attacks could happen. I think I just gave a mouthful, huh? I jumped around a little bit, but I know you followed me.
Yeah, you're definitely moving at a very fast pace. So, I think that you have enough evidence in the book that puts this guy away. And I know you've been talking to a lot of people. You walk in the halls of Congress and the Senate, passing out books, and they're like, well, I don't know. And I know you've been to some very high level sources that could put this out in a bigger audience. So I'm happy that you came to like a grassroots type guy. This is how this stuff gets out there. You've been constantly pushing on this, and this is the way I was for a long time as well. What do you think is going to happen going forward with now that you're revealing on this level?
Well, what is going to happen is, I believe that the information in this book will likely serve as a precipice to get this man indicted, to get John Brennan indicted. I believe that once that happens, I believe that he'll be indicted. That's just there's just way too much. There's way too much information, Michael, against this guy and the wrongdoings, the things that he was involved in his 35-year career. Look, he interviews with Bill Maher in 2018, and Maher says, the speculation that you're doing what you do to monetize. And he says, no, I don't have any interest in monetizing. I spent 35 years in this country. I love this country. Dude, what we show in High Stakes Treason is that he did exactly that, is that he monetized himself at the behest of American lives.
Yeah.
At the behest of, people can Google Boston Marathon bombing, and like one of the first images is a guy with his legs blown off, being carted off in a wheelchair. This is just heinous. This is disgusting, and it's not tolerable, right? As an American, as constitutional Republicans, which any citizen of this country is, because it's a constitutional republic. Doesn't matter if what your politics are, people are Democrats or not. As people that love this country, and unfortunately, it looks like we're certainly invaded with a lot of folks here that don't like this country, and even folks that are being born in this country don't like this country. It seems, Kamala Harris, it's all. But the fact of the matter is, you've got a guy born in New Jersey. Votes for Gus Hall, votes communist in the 70s at University of Texas, or he just gotten out of Texas Austin. This is a red flag. But this is what I think is going on, Michael. This is what I think is going on in what's called the deep state, right? So Trump has talked about deep state, fake news over the course of his years in D.C., which has really allowed Americans to second guess their trust in the government, and there shouldn't, it's hard to decipher who should be trusted and who shouldn't be, but there's plenty of folks that should not be trusted, unfortunately. And I think what's going on in this shadow government, which is nothing new. You're talking about JFK, and let's not forget JFK wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces.
Right.
That's a quote that was printed in the New York Times. This is a speech that he gave at the Waldorf Astoria. So he that it was not operating in the best interest of the United States. Now, not to say that every CIA operation doesn't benefit the U.S., doesn't say that every CIA agent is not, doesn't love the country, but at the very helm of the CIA, it looks like JFK knew that there was something awry going on. And we can even go to Eisenhower, right? Because Eisenhower in his farewell address talks about the military-industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and let me just mention this, because a lot of people critique Trump for going into Venezuela, and thank goodness we've got Delta Force. I mean, who would want to mess with, if you're in China and you're Russia, I don't think there'd be a country on this planet that would want to mess around with Delta Force or anyone in the upper echelons like yourself. We train killing machines. You don't want to mess around with that. That would be my opinion. I mean, it was so impressive what happened in that operation. But let me state this. We did not go in, we meaning Trump, the folks that support that, Trump did not go in to Caracas and extract Maduro so that the United States could control the oil. I mean, you got one or two options. You either allow Maduro to stay in power and continue to sell the Chinese and benefit that communist regime and the Iranians and the Russians, or you go in and you take that away from them and you control it. Okay, so fine. So yeah, you do go in and control it. But more importantly is the Smartmatic, the voting system that was created by Venezuelans to put Chavez into power and then to keep Maduro into power. You had something like 30 direct line underneath Maduro. They were all billionaires. The 30 people directly under Maduro were all billionaires. They didn't have a middle class. The other folks are living day to day. Some of them, of course, eating out of garbage cans, but there's no middle class in Venezuela.
They're trying to tip the military with, here we're going to give you $50 million, but they're billionaires. It's like, what? That's chump changed us. So he had them all paid off.
Yeah. But that's important, I believe, for people to understand. And remember this John Brennan connection to the Belgrade server, the data center manipulating the Dominion servers. It's a nasty web, and it looks like this former avowed communist, or at least communist sympathizer. I don't know that he registered, every presidential election as a communist, but you might as well paint him as a communist, as Roger Stone does. Certainly I do. I've never sympathized with any communist policies. That's the guy under the Obama administration. But to answer your question, Michael, I believe that as this gets kind of exposed more and more, what we're going to see is that shadow government, right, that's been operating probably prior to the red wave, prior to the McCarthyism, in quietly and slowly instilling their communist literature and policies, controlling the Department of Education under Carter, that sort of thing. This is a multi-decade, 100-year or more rollout to invade the country in a very slow and stealth manner. And look, they've got a guy in Uganda born. This isn't an American guy running the mayor office in New York right now. He's not an American. He doesn't have America as his best interest. He has the people that financed him to put him in the office at the best interest. And these are communists. It's a communist threat to this country. Anyway,
you made an interesting point in the book, and a lot of other people, myself included, have alluded to this, that, we've been pretty much controlled by the city of London for a long time economically. And they're probably some of the people that are supporting people like Brennan, keeping them in power, keeping them safe, that on the judicial and so forth. So you made the point, and I think everybody for a long time has agreed that these people should be arrested. I agree. I think they're going to be arrested. But do you think that it's going to be a domino effect that goes all the way back to the city of London? Because that's really where the criminal activity starts.
Yeah, and I'm a big, like I said, this is why this information regarding Brennan, this is why I pushed to get this published. Initially, Skyhorse, Tony Lyons was going to he was looking at possibly publishing it. Post Hill gave me the contract to get it published. But this is why I've been pushing it so hard. And by the way, the Daily Mail wrote an article on this. It got squashed by their legal department. It was approved by the editor. And New York Post has known about this for almost 10, at least 10 months. Miranda Devine, but New York Post hasn't put anything out about this. And as we spoke before this time, the interview, Newsmax. I hand delivered a copy of this to Newsmax. They've done nothing about it. So I'm a big follow the money guy, and you bring up some really important and interesting points on the Delaware. John Paul Jones on the USS Alfred, the flag that he flew, and people can go into their search engine right now and show this. The U.S. Grand Union flag. That is the first flag. Washington's basically a union that was developing. That was the first flag that was flown. Well, that flag is almost identical to the British East Indies Company flag, and the British East Indies Company was created and was controlled by the Rothschild for a couple centuries. That's, as you talk about, the City of London. The City of London distinction. If people aren't familiar, the City of London controls the monarch. It's not the other way around. The monarch is controlled by a bank that is sovereign and not part of the United Kingdom. That's called City of London. It's formerly initially called it was Londinium. It was a Roman trading port, and William the Conqueror in 1066 couldn't conquer London, but he conquered the rest of the British Isles because he was subservient to Londinium. They financed him. It's remained that way, and that's why they have a monarch. That's why the British have a monarch today, because they're subservient to this Roman system, which is of course City of London. Now, how does that tie into the U.S. Grand Union flag?
Yeah, and if someone
Yeah.
if the monarchy gets out of hand, like Charles I did, they'll behead him. Charles I, and then they had the Civil War between and Britain, and Oliver Cromwell, and eventually the British were like, these guys suck, and then they got Charles II back in there. So how much was he controlled by the cabal? Because the City of London burned down in 666, and there's all these different things that basically ties into this City of London thing. It's pretty wacky.
Yeah, but as far as peeling back the layers to that, with the 36, I don't know what the national deficit stands on. This is president number 47. We had one president that left office without a deficit. 1 out of 47. Most people have no clue. And that was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson ran on the platform and the re-election platform to kill the bank. He was the guy that killed the banks. George Washington, as a matter of fact, he owned shares of the British East Indies Company with his wife. So he was receiving financing. The City of London will stay, it's like a Hegelian dialectic. They'll stay neutral. They'll fund both sides of a conflict. So arguably, King George and George Washington were being funded in large part, and I know some money was coming in to fund the Continental Army by a Polish guy, but in large part, it sounds like they were funded by the same entity, this sovereign entity called the City of London. So it's gone on. It's something that took out Lincoln. If you ask me, it's the reason Lincoln, because Lincoln did the same thing as JFK, inserted the silver-backed certificates, and they've been so. Trump, and I don't know how much Trump knows. I crossed his paths very briefly. I never exchanged any dialogue with him, but I don't know how much he knows, but it looks like he's targeting the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, people want to talk about constitutionalism. I mean, that's completely unconstitutional in itself. 1913, Woodrow Wilson, right? So if we begin to peel back, and let's say this guy Brennan is held accountable, he's convicted of treason. That would be that'd be my desire. He's a traitor. He's, as I mentioned, I compare it to Benedict Arnold in the book.
Benedict Arnold,
that is the beginning of Americans to really understand that 12 years in public education hasn't educated us all. It's just basically given us information we need to be good cogs in a wheel. And I believe it will help Americans to realize these threats. And let me pull back for a minute and say people need to start looking at the United Nations, because the United States funds primarily the United Nations.
Yeah.
And the United Nations does not have our Constitution in its best interest. And as an example, the USAID, it looks like was one of the main financiers of the Dominion system, voting system. So basically, we're funding USAID. USAID is funding Dominion, yet Dominion's rigging our election. That's like national suicide.
Yeah.
And there's Michael. There's a guy out of Stanford that, and back in 2016, when I started doing this podcast, when I started looking into the government corruption, there's a guy named Anthony Sutton, and he was a Hoover fellow at. He was a fellow at the Hoover Institute in Stanford. Happened to be British born, but he writes a book. He starts talking about Prescott Bush funding Nazi Germany, and he gives a talk in Miami Beach, 1972. That's where I was living at the time, and I started what I call discussions of truth. And he gets reprimanded. He goes back to Palo Alto. They reprimand him, and he says, "Well, you've hired me to do the research and show you what I'm finding. Yeah, you want to reprimand me." So he walks away from Stanford. That right there caught my eye, because Stanford, in my history, I've always held Stanford and those folks to a high level. It's a highly intellectual institution. Yet this guy's walking away from that lucrative position, and he writes a book that caught my interest. It's called Federal Reserve Conspiracy, and it goes into this historical lineup of how, like you just said, how the United States and the corporation that was set up to fund the government, it's linked back to London. So Josh Yoder is a guy. He's an airline pilot, and during the lockdowns, he was very vocal about wearing masks. He didn't want people to have to wear masks to travel, and that was one of their goals. The deep state goal is to make us all conform to wearing masks. So I'm in San Antonio, Michael, and I'm talking to Josh, and I'm describing what you and I are talking about in regards to the national deficit, being subservient to a shadow government. What is the shadow government? How does the city of London play into that? Mel Kay's been talking about the Bank of International Settlements now for a few years. I think she's written or she's writing a book on it.
Really?
You'd like that a lot. Happy to make an introduction if you like. And
Yeah, I've done shows with her. She's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So he says, "Wait a second, Ian. You say you mean we obtained our national geographic independence in 1776, but what you're arguing is that we never obtained our financial independence in 1776." And I said, "Josh, that's exactly what I'm saying." That's exactly what I'm saying. So
I completely agree with that. I don't think we ever broke free from them. I think they've been controlling us ever since. I mean, look at Benedict Arnold. They paid him to be a traitor. So there's been a lot of people like John Brennan. They probably paid to be traitors.
Yeah, it looks like that's probably the case.
Yeah,
Michael, is that John Brennan is hiding the illegal stock holdings, probably because he knew that it was going to get sold to this British entity. But my question is this. My question is, if you historically you're looking at, and if you look at the British currency compared to ours, I don't know if it still is, but the pound was the most valuable currency on the planet.
sure.
And if we are still subservient to the City of London, as you and I would both argue, I suspect, the question then becomes, what intelligence? And remember, I made that connection back to Cambridge University. There's also a guy named Sir Richard Dearlove that heads something called Crossword Analytics, which is a cybersecurity firm. There's a lot of these hidden strings that are going back to England, and I don't necessarily want to pinpoint and poke fingers at the British, because the British, remember, are subservient to this system that goes back to Rome. It looks like Londinium. And then what has Rome set up over the centuries? Well, they've set up a safe haven financially called Switzerland and Basel. And this is where it looks like the Bank of International Settlements, the World Economic Forum, are able to maneuver all of their transactions globally, manipulate all the central banks globally, including the Federal Reserve that we operate on. And they do that through this very well disguised and created apparatus, financial apparatus out of Switzerland. So, it's not, again, I'm not poking fingers necessarily at the English, but they too have got to wake up and say, hey, man, you love the king, you love the queen, they're great to look at. They have their beautiful chariots and whatever, their Buckingham palaces and that sort of thing. But wait, dude, I mean, how how free are you, right? Well, you're not that free, and you need to stoke and grow that middle class more. That would be my word to the British, and I think the Americans are falling. Unfortunately, they're falling victim to that same disguise.
Yeah, and they're Londonistan or whatever we want to call it now. And they're basically replacing the people that are waking up. And I think that's what they were trying to do here in America, and that's what President Trump has basically shut down the border and started these flying people out of here that don't belong. So that's one of the things that they've done over time. They just replace the people get too smart for their pants, and then they just like kill them off, or create a war, and they get destitute, and then they start for Londistan. Yeah. So somebody put it in the chat. So there's definitely movement, I think, to push back on this, and your work and coming on and talking about this, it's you're stretching yourself out there. This is this obviously no one wanted to touch this. You had lots of people look at it. You had lawyers look at it, and they're like, "No, we're not going to do this." So there's not a lot of people with the cojones these days to push this out there. But once it does, it often gets traction that I've noticed. The one good example is when they pushed the COVID-19 shots on us. 70% of unfortunately United States and even more in Europe got that shot. But here in the United States, we were just hammering that shot, nonstop. And eventually they got to the point where like, well, we're just going to start coming in your houses and vaccinate you. And everybody's like, you come in our houses, you're going to die. And then they're like, yeah. Okay, I think we reached our point where we're going to have to like back off now. So where is the point where, we expose this and everybody gets on board with it, and we say enough of this? We're going to expose these people, and they're going to stand trial, and we're going to get justice for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the statistic that I've read is something like there are 500 million privately owned weapons in this country by private citizens. That's what's standing in the way of us falling victim to a Mao Zedong type scenario that the Chinese fell victim to over many decades. Mao slaughtered arguably something like 60 million people. He took away all their private ownership. And, people talk about Venezuela and they say, well, why didn't the Venezuelans, if Maduro was so bad, why didn't they stand up to him? Well, because he had a buyback program, because the citizens didn't have guns. They couldn't defend themselves. It's exactly what happened in Cuba. It's exactly what happened in Venezuela. It's happened in China. It's exactly what they keep pushing with their psyops.
On and on.
Go ahead.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they
stand
keep
up,
pushing
but
them.
you're going to get they're going to get the machine gun. They think that 20,000 people died in Tiananmen Square because they stood up. So it's you're not going to go against some of these people. They'll give you a little. We're going to do this, and everything's going to be okay. And then everybody's like, "Oh, that's good." And then to find out later, decades later, like there are in China now, that it's just as bad, if not worse. Then they shouldn't have given up. They should have all just pushed back and taken down the government.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioning the COVID shots, and I get a visit where I live. I get a visit from a census worker that wanted me to look at one of her pamphlets. And before she would approach me, she says, "Well, sir," I answer the door, "Sir, you notice that for your safety, I'm standing 6 feet back, 6 feet away from you. Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. What have you got?" She says, "I'd like to take your temperature before I hand this pamphlet to you." I says, get off this property right now. Get out of here."
Good man.
I mean, dude, you're talking about, yeah, you're going to get a bullet. So I says, if we allow this crap to keep building, that person, that census worker, is going to show up with an armed armed enforcer.
Yeah.
So it's who's going to get the bullet first, me or them? right? And that's where it's coming to, and that's exactly what you said. They don't want to face us. So how many years away are we from their ultimate goal of dismantling, disarming our republic? Hopefully they're a couple centuries, because our voices will echo and people will get what's going on and reverse this tyrannic, what looks like the tyrannic UN. Pull the UN out of New York. Let them go somewhere else. Let them go over to Amsterdam or something. Go into Europe. We should have nothing to do with the United Nations. We have the most massive military. Nobody's going to mess with us. That's just my view. It would take the Russians, the Chinese, it would take an entire gang of those commie countries to gang up and fight us. And nobody's look. At the end of the day, it's guys like you and me that are standing verbally right in their way. And I don't think, Michael, that this John Brennan ever saw. I don't know if he knows about the book. He hasn't responded to me. He hasn't responded to the Daily Mail. I don't know if he had any clue that there was an former FBI guy whittling away at his desk that was trying to get that message out. And John certainly never thought he'd run into a guy like me. So, and I'm just trying to push you. I'm just being a megaphone. That's all I'm doing is I'm pushing the information out there, and I'm exposing the fraud that has been conducted under Barack Obama. And more importantly, is Zygmunt Brzezinski. Zygmunt Brzezinski, National Security Advisor under Carter, if I got that right, he's laying the groundwork to slot in what has been termed to me as a penetration agent, to slot in this communist brainwashed sympathizer John Brennan into the system to be able to centralize all that intel and run it at his own enrichment.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we talk about weapons, and so Second Amendment. In Virginia, they're going to ban the sale of assault weapons and high capacity magazines. It's one of the laws they're pushing right now. It started with it was vetoed by Virginia Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin, but it could become law under the Democrat governor that's coming in, Abigail Spanberger. So it's one of those things they're slipping in. They slip these things in. I remember in New York they were talking about doing some place that they would start to put people in concentration camps, pretty much, if they didn't get vaccinated, and the people push back on that. There's so many different things. Obviously, John Brennan has been doing some illicit things that basically probably killed a lot of people. Probably some of the people that I work with over time. And when I was in the CIA and John Brennan was there, I wasn't very happy with him. But it's one of those things that sometimes you got good people and sometimes you don't, and sometimes you get people like a lot of us knew that this guy was a really, really bad character. But there's very little you can do. Where do you think the pushback is going to come from the American public on some of this stuff going forward?
Yeah, no, you're saying it just as it is, and Mike Flynn, who I stay in contact with on a very surface basis, but I was active with something called the Reawaken Tour, which he was running with Clay Clark,
Mm-hmm.
and Flynn would say, guys, when he would talk to people, he'd say it's got to start. It's got to start locally. Well, if it starts locally, that means grassroots, right?
That's right.
So you gotta make. If you see your community, what I would say, if you see your community starting to sway communists, you just flat out call it communist. I mean, Gavin Newsom. This guy's so brainwashed. He's so part of that socialist agenda. It's disgusting, and I don't know that he truly realizes it. Right? I think he's just kind of played that. He's played into that kind of nook with Pelosi and the Feinsteins and the people that have influenced him over the decades. But it really starts on that grassroots.
Yeah.
So it's even with your neighbor, right? If your neighbors starting, it's all about the little things. And you've even said it, Michael. It's about guys like you, podcasts like you, voices like myself. That's where it starts. And then the root grows, and it gets bigger. And it's impossible with that Second Amendment, without their ability to take that away from Americans. that they'll never get to this country, in my view. They just won't. They'll continue. The UN will seep in. The NATO will seep in. They'll centralize different agencies. But as long as the American spirit stays alive through the veins of the average citizen, and people need it. The middle class in our country is just, it's vanishing, right?
Yeah.
Home prices, just milk prices, car prices, all those types of things, and that's all related to inflation and the fact that we continue to drive this national debt higher, and we're not cramping down on the Federal Reserve. So some of these things that over the past couple of decades are considered conspiracy theory, right? And that's a term that was created after JFK died, got his head blown off. Those things, conspiracy theorists. Well, the more people dig into them, then they'll realize these are fact-based conspiracies, which means there is an agenda to overthrow, not necessarily overthrow, but there's an agenda to bring down this country from inside and from a stealth manner. It's a definite conspiracy. It's not theory.
Yeah. And here's your website for highstakestreason.com. How John Brennan compromised American security for millions. High stakes treason. Bigger than Watergate. I agree. Much bigger than Watergate. And great information on here. So fantastic job on this. What's the future for you?
Yeah, the future too. Thanks for asking. I've already started on a second edition of this.
Nice.
There's just so much information that's rolling out and developing, and as soon as we start hearing Brennan's name again in the mainstream with the subpoenas, I've already started a second edition. So my goal, the book came out July 22nd. I let Steve Bannon know that I was working on it. As soon as I got the message from the publisher that it was live, Bannon had me on in 3 hours. It's Natalie Winters, one of his anchors that hosts me. He's out in the field. He calls in. He says, "This is the most exquisitely timed release of a book in the history of publishing."
No
That's what
doubt.
Steve Bannon said about that, because Trump had the president of the Philippines in the Oval Office that day, and he called Obama out for treason. Dude, Obama likely was born in Kenya. I mean, this whole
Absolutely
this
was.
whole notion of this guy being born in Hawaii, give me a break. I don't buy it. He's a deep state plant, and he's a nice person. I suspect he seems cordial, diplomatic. He's got a nice tone to him, but he's a plant. He's a plant for this communist agenda. He's not an American. I don't believe it. I don't buy it. I mean, I don't. So what's next is the second edition, and I'd like to have that second edition out for June
Oh, good.
22nd, which was when this one was released.
Fantastic. Yeah, that'd be great. So yeah, I highly recommend everybody, get this book, High Stakes Treason. It's going to give you a lot of insights. Man, like we talked about before the show, I could go in a lot of depth, a lot of stuff that you shared that I know in the background is absolutely true. So it's going to be something that's going to change, I think, mankind going forward. Your book, so it's going to be very helpful. And this video, this show, everyone share this like crazy. Talk about it, get it out there, because this is how we take them down. This is the grassroots level, and you're going to work your way up, and you're going to get bigger, better shows as this gets exposed. That's the way this works. So fantastic, congratulations.
Michael, I appreciate it. And what people will get from the way that this book is written is they will understand the institutionalization of the way that the government has been intruded upon and invaded. It's systematic. It's highly intelligent. It's highly sophisticated. It's meticulous. These people are standing in the background. They're not urgent, right? They're not running an urgent. This is a multi-decade effort, and unfortunately for John Brennan, from the allegations that I present, he's left a paper trail. So there's absolutely no reason that he's not caught red-handed.
Fantastic.
And 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 yeah, so that's the only other thing I would stress people to start questioning the UN.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, you start to question that when President Trump went there with Melania, and they started, they turned the escalator off, and all kind
Right.
of crazy stuff. So he wasn't welcome there, even though it's like you said, the United States basically funds the UN. So let's just cut them off. It's built on very unsacred ground. There used to be a slaughterhouse where the UN is. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah,
For
it's
cows?
built on cows and whatever. It's an old slaughterhouse site. I guess the Rockefellers bought it and gave it to them to build a UN there. So crazy stuff.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's cool.
That's a good one, right? I
Yeah.
didn't know that till just recently too. Somebody shared that with me. Oh wow, there's 1,666 people watching, and I talked about how the fire of London was in 1,666. So how about that? All right. So yeah, it's like a little sign there. I like that from universe. All right, Ian Trotter. Thank you so much. Very, very good information, and we look forward to seeing you zoom to the top with this information in your next book.
Cool, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you.